Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a theological concept today that has honestly tied philosophers and thinkers in knots for centuries. We're going to unpack this profound, age-old tension between absolute divine perfection and, well, inherent human imperfection. Our source material tackles this head-on, and it actually presents a really unique, highly specific framework for understanding how these two vastly different realities interact. We're going to map out exactly how this text resolves what, at first glance anyway, seems like a completely unsolvable contradiction.
Okay, let's dive into this. The central question driving our source text sits right at the heart of the human experience. Can absolute perfection and human flaws truly coexist? It's an incredibly compelling intellectual tension. Because think about it, ordinarily we assume that absolute purity and deep imperfection are just like oil and water, right? They naturally repel each other. But the text we're looking at today forces us to look directly at this apparent incompatibility. It asks us what actually happens when a perfectly holy God comes into intimate, close proximity with flawed humanity. Do they violently collide? Does one just completely obliterate the other? I mean, historically, in a lot of ancient cultures, interacting with the divine was seen as literally fatal for mortals. So this core question is really the engine for everything we're about to explore.
Section 1. The Great Theological Paradox. A really great tension.
So the source material establishes this incredibly high-stakes scenario right out of the gate. It describes a perfectly holy God intimately cohabiting with flawed humans. And, the key word you really need to zero in on here is intimately. We aren't talking about some distant, detached perfection just observing our flaws from afar, or a deity sitting on an unreachable mountaintop. No, the text explicitly frames this as a situation of extreme, almost dangerous proximity. Under any normal logical framework, this is a recipe for absolute destruction. How in the world can supreme holiness share space with flaws without that space completely fracturing? The sheer magnitude of this tension demands some kind of resolution.
Moving into Section 2, Rethinking Divine Holiness.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is how it maps out a total flip of our expected outcome. Usually, when we imagine absolute holiness coming face-to-face with human flaws, our knee-jerk reaction is to assume punishment. We naturally think, well, perfection simply cannot tolerate imperfection, so it's going to strike it down or push it entirely away. It's a very human assumption, totally based on our own limitations. But the source text argues strongly against this reflex. Instead, it posits a completely different reality. Holiness acts as a purifying light. It radically reframes the whole nature of divine proximity. It suggests that the ultimate purpose of this encounter isn't alienation, it's not judgment, and it's certainly not destruction. It's actually something entirely different and profoundly constructive.
Which brings us to Section 3. The Purifying Light. Healing, not harm.
Let's delve a bit deeper into this specific metaphor of the purifying light, because the text relies on it heavily. According to our source, this light has some very specific functions. First up, it exposes our true nature. Light naturally banishes shadows. It reveals what's actually there: flaws, imperfections, the whole shebang. But crucially, this exposure is not for the sake of judgment, because as the text emphasizes, it does not condemn. This is a massive theological pivot. Finally, and most importantly, it purifies rather than destroys. The heat of this light is restorative. Think of it less like a destructive laser beam. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a surgeon's scalpel or a silversmith's fire. It meticulously burns away the impurities without annihilating the person holding them. This changes absolutely everything about how we understand this interaction. Let's look at how this builds into a broader life-changing process.
Section 4, Driven Toward Sanctification.
So, the crucial point is that this encounter has a very distinct trajectory. The source uses a specific term for this outcome: sanctification. According to the text, sanctification is this active, ongoing process driven by encountering that exact purifying light we just talked about. It's the literal mechanism that resolves our initial paradox of proximity, by exposing our true nature and actively choosing to transform rather than destroy the believer. This process explains exactly how absolute perfection can intimately cohabit with flawed humans. This isn't just about barely surviving an encounter with perfection. The proximity is actually what drives the sanctification. They can coexist because the perfection is actively at work healing the imperfection rather than just punishing it.
And finally, Section 5, Isaiah in the Temple.
Abstract theology is always a whole lot easier to grasp when you have a tangible story, and our source material recognizes this brilliantly. To ground these lofty concepts, the text points directly to the historical narrative of Isaiah. It paints this incredibly vivid scene of a man who suddenly finds himself standing directly in the divine temple.
He's completely surrounded by thick smoke. The very foundation of the building is shaking, and he is trembling at the sheer, overwhelming reality of ultimate perfection right in front of his face. In that moment, hyper-aware of his own deep flaws, he's terrified that he's going to be instantly destroyed by the sheer magnitude of the divine presence. This specific story is held up as the prime, practical illustration of literally everything we've covered so far.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact sequence the text has outlined for us. Step 1, the encounter. Isaiah is suddenly thrust into intimate proximity with God's holiness in the temple. Step 2, the exposure. As the light of that perfection shines on him, his flaws are instantly recognized. In the text, he cries out that he is a man of unclean lips, just utterly terrified, because his imperfections are completely exposed for all to see. But then we reach the resolution in step 3, purification. Rather than being struck down or consumed by fire, a burning coal from the altar is touched directly to his lips. He is purified, not destroyed. That burning coal acts as the silversmith's fire we mentioned earlier. The incredible tension of that initial paradox is beautifully resolved through this sequence of transformative light.
Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with today. The source material presents a massive paradigm shift here. It completely changes the lens through which human imperfection is viewed when brought into the presence of the divine. If the ultimate reality of absolute holiness isn't condemnation, but rather a restorative, purifying light meant to drive our sanctification, well, that changes the entire equation of how we interact with perfection. So, based on the framework we've just mapped out together, I'll leave you with this question. When exposed to that purifying light, how do we view our own flaws? Are they a cause for inevitable destruction, or are they simply the starting point for a deep, meaningful transformation? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and I really hope this deep dive leaves you with plenty to ponder.